Greetings, fellow readers and story lovers, and welcome back to my channel. This is my second video on the final scene of Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare. If this is your first time on my channel, and this seems like an illogical place to start, please avail yourself of the card popping up in the upper right-hand corner right now. Otherwise, let's dive straight back in with the recap. One of the most important things to remember is that the tragedy in Romeo and Juliet is caused by a series of misinformation and miscommunication. Romeo and Juliet get married in complete secrecy. Only they, Juliet's nurse, and Friar Lawrence, who marries them, know about it. Their marriage is the reason Romeo refuses to fight Tybalt in the following scene, but because none of the characters present know about his marriage to Juliet, Mercutio misinterprets Romeo's behavior as cowardice and fights Tybalt himself, which gets Mercutio killed. Romeo then kills Tybalt in revenge for his friend's death, which gets him banished from Verona. After Tybalt's death, Lord Capulet decides to accelerate Juliet's marriage to Count Paris, believing that the wedding will lift her out of what he assumes is grief over her cousin's death. He arranges it for this coming Thursday, which, if you remember, is just 2 days away in the timeline of the play. Juliet refuses because she's already married to Romeo, and being married to two people at the same time was considered a serious sin in those days. But of course, her parents don't know that's the reason, and she can't tell them because Romeo only went and got himself banished from Verona. Also, he is a Montague, and I don't think Juliet's parents would have been very accepting of their only daughter being married to a Montague due to the ongoing feud between their two families. But that's not something we'll ever find out because Juliet never tells her parents that she's married to Romeo. In order to prevent her marriage to Count Paris, she goes to Friar Lawrence and asks him for a solution, and also makes it very clear that if he doesn't have one, she'd rather kill herself than be forced to marry Paris. And just to reiterate, suicide was considered a grave and mortal sin in those days, which means Juliet would have damned herself not only in this life, but also the next one. You can see why the friar would try and prevent that, can't you? So he gives Juliet a potion that will make her appear dead. Her parents will bury her, and he will inform Romeo of the plan via letter, so that Romeo can sneak into the Capulet tomb and take her away to Mantua, where they will live happily ever after. Of course, the audience already knows that it won't happen like that. Oh, the first part of the plan goes down brilliantly. Juliet takes the potion, everyone believes she is dead, Friar Lawrence arranges the funeral, and her parents bury her in the family tomb. So far, so good, right? Well, here's where everything comes crashing down. Balthazar, Romeo's servant, goes to Mantua and informs Romeo of Juliet's death, and Romeo immediately turns around and buys some poison to kill himself. And Friar John comes back to Verona, still carrying Friar Lawrence's letter with him because he was prevented from delivering it by a plague quarantine. So nobody is in full possession of all the facts. And this is what eventually leads to the final tragedy. At the end of the last video, we also talked about how Paris and Romeo approach Juliet's tomb very differently. Paris is calm, dignified, and orderly. He follows social convention and mourns Juliet in the socially appropriate way by strewing flowers onto her grave. On the other hand, Romeo's grief makes him, in his own words, savage wild. He threatens his servant with bodily harm and physically forces his way into the Capulet tomb. He also intends to kill himself, which again Elizabethans would have considered a mortal sin. Now let's talk about what happens when these two men run into each other, shall we? Paris notices Romeo opening the Capulet tomb and says this: "This is that banished haughty Montague that murdered my love's cousin, with which grief it is supposed the fair creature died, and here is come to do some villainous shame to the dead bodies. I will apprehend him." Okay, so here's what Paris knows. Romeo killed Tybalt. That's who Paris means when he says my love's cousin, and got himself banished from Verona. So already Romeo's presence at the Capulet tomb goes against the prince's decree and would therefore have been considered a crime. People, and this includes Paris and Juliet's family, believe that Juliet died over her grief for Tybalt. Because remember, nobody knows that she and Romeo are married, so from their point of view, what other reason is there? And because Paris doesn't know about Romeo and Juliet's secret marriage, he doesn't have any reason to assume Romeo is at the Capulet tomb for any noble or righteous reasons. Instead, he assumes it's to do some villainous shame to the dead bodies. He thinks Romeo wants to desecrate Juliet and Tybalt's corpses. Also, he doesn't say he wants to kill Romeo. Instead, he says, I will apprehend him, meaning he wants to arrest Romeo. He just wants justice for Juliet and for Verona. Unfortunately for Paris, Romeo is equally as determined to go through with his plan as Paris is to apprehend and stop him. So when Paris approaches him, Romeo says this: Good gentle youth, tempt not a desperate man. Fly hence and leave me. Think upon these gone. Let them affright thee. I beseech thee, youth. Put not another sin upon my head by urging me to fury. Oh, be gone! By heaven, I love thee better than I love myself, for I come hither armed against myself. Stay not, be gone. Live, and hereafter say, a madman's mercy bid thee run away. First of all, he repeatedly urges Paris to go and leave him alone. 3 times, to be exact. In line 60, he says, Fly hence and leave me. Then in line 63, he says, Oh, be gone. And in line 66, he says it again, Stay not, be gone. So I think it's fair to say that Romeo tries his best to get Paris to leave. He also calls him youth twice in lines 59 and 61. Now, on the one hand, this tells the audience that Romeo doesn't recognize who he's talking to, either because it's dark and he genuinely can't see his face, or because he's too preoccupied with his plan to kill himself to pay close enough attention to notice. It also tells us something that oftentimes gets overlooked, especially when we only study the text and don't go to see the play at a theater. Paris is a young man too, probably about Romeo's age. This makes Paris another tragically young victim of the unfortunate circumstances. Romeo also says, By heaven, I love thee better than I love myself, which shows that Romeo is not acting out of aggression towards Paris, but rather out of desperation. He really just wants Paris to go away. However, he does still threaten Paris when he says, Put not another sin upon my head by urging me to fury. Basically, he's saying that if Paris doesn't go away, he'll have no choice but to kill him. This is what he's referring to when he says it would put another sin upon his head. Another way of saying this would be, I will have even more blood on my hands. Now, this could simply be a way to reveal to the audience how unstable and volatile Romeo's thinking has become, but to me, it sounds remarkably familiar to the way Romeo talked in Act 3, Scene 1, just before and after he kills Tybalt. Before, he says that Juliet's beauty has made him effeminate, and afterwards he calls himself Fortune's fool. He's always finding something or someone else to blame his actions on. It's his love for Juliet that has made him a coward. It's the work of fate that he killed Tybalt. And now he sort of frames it as Paris's own fault if he has to kill him. Almost as if he's saying, if you don't leave, I'll get angry and won't be responsible for my actions. It's remarkable character consistency, if you ask me. Romeo also says this, For I come hither armed against myself. Now, to the audience, this is a clear reference to the poison he's carrying in order to kill himself. But how on earth is Paris supposed to know that? Like I've said multiple times, suicide was considered a very serious sin, so people didn't go around assuming people had the intention to kill themselves. And finally, Romeo literally calls himself a madman in line 67, which means he freely acknowledges that he's lost his mind. And I think it's fairly easy to see why Paris wouldn't trust him after all this. Because of course he doesn't. From Paris's point of view, Romeo is a dangerous criminal. Why would he listen to him? So, because Paris won't leave Romeo alone, they get into a fight, which ends with Romeo killing Paris. With his dying breath, Paris utters his last wish to be buried with Juliet in the Capulet tomb. Now, on the one hand, this could be seen as romantic and as further evidence that Paris's feelings for Juliet were genuine. On the other, you could interpret this as Paris seeing it as his only rightful place as Juliet's intended husband. Again, Shakespeare leaves it fairly ambiguous and open to interpretation. Now, Romeo's response to this is also worth taking a closer look at. He says, "In faith, I will," by which he means, "I will bury you with Juliet. Let me peruse this face. Mercutius kinsman, noble county Paris. What said my man when my betossed soul did not attend him as we rode? I think he told me Paris should have married Juliet. Said he not so? Or did I dream it so? Or am I mad, hearing him talk of Juliet, to think it was so? Oh, give me thy hand, one writ with me in sour misfortune's book. I'll bury thee in a triumphant grave. A grave? Oh no, a lantern, slaughtered youth, for here lies Juliet, and her beauty makes this vault a feasting presence full of light. Death, lie thou here by a dead man interred." So he only realizes who he's killed after Paris is already dead. We also see how he questions his own sanity when he's not sure if he remembers Balthasar telling him about Paris's intention to marry Juliet, or if he dreamed and or imagined it. And then he says, "One writ with me in sour misfortune's book," which means that he puts Paris and himself on the same level. They're both victims of the same tragic circumstance. He takes that identification even further when he calls himself a dead man interred in line 87. Romeo is still physically alive, but he treats his death like a foregone conclusion because he already thinks of himself as dead. To him, this is not one living man burying another, but a doomed man lying another victim of the same tragedy to rest. He also honors Paris's last wish and carries him into the tomb, which shows that even after killing Paris, and even when driven mad by his own grief, he still does the honorable thing. Which means that neither Romeo nor Paris act as villains here. They're just two men with fundamentally different wants. Paris wants justice, and Romeo wants to be left alone, who act on incomplete information. Paris assumes Romeo is a dangerous criminal and wants to apprehend him, which he sees as his civic duty. And Romeo thinks Juliet is dead and wants to be left alone so that he can die with her. You can see where they're both coming from, can't you? Now let's move on to Romeo's farewell. Before we look at Romeo's farewell itself, I want to briefly return to the moment he opens the tomb, because it sets up the way he imagines death throughout his speech. He says, "Thou detestable maw, thou womb of death, gorged with the dearest morsel of the earth, thus I enforce thy rotten jaws to open, and in despite I'll cram thee with more food." Now, on the literal level, this is just a description of him opening the tomb, but figuratively, he imagines the tomb, and by extension, death itself, as something that has devoured Juliet. Notice all the food metaphors he uses. He calls the doors to the tomb a detestable maw, with maw being another word for mouth, and compares it to rotten jaws that he forces open. He describes the tomb as gorged, which means stuffed with food, and says he will cram more food, by which he means himself, into it. This speaks to his determination, almost as though he's challenging death. You've eaten Juliet, now eat me too. But there's also something very forceful about it. Whereas death has gorged itself with Juliet, Romeo will cram himself down death's throat, i.e., force death to eat him too. Now let's look at Romeo's final soliloquy, shall we? "How oft when men are at the point of death have they been merry, which their keepers call a lightning before death. Oh, how may I call as lightning? O my love, my wife! Death that hath sucked the honey of thy breath hath had no power yet upon thy beauty. Thou art not conquered, beauty's ensign yet is crimson in thy lips and in thy cheeks, and death's pale flag is not advanced there. Tybalt, liest thou there in thy bloody sheet? Oh, what more favour can I do to thee than with that hand that cut thy youth in twain, to sunder his that was thine enemy? Forgive me, cousin. Ah, dear Juliet, why art thou yet so fair? Shall I believe that unsubstantial death is amorous, and that the lean abhorred monster keeps thee here in dark to be his paramour? For fear of that, I still will stay with thee, and never from this palace of dim night depart again. Here will I remain, with worms that are thy chambermaids, or here will I set up my everlasting rest, and shake the yoke of inauspicious stars from this world-wearied flesh. Eyes, look your last, arms, take your last embrace, and lips, O you, the doors of breath, seal with a righteous kiss a dateless bargain to engrossing death. Come, bitter conduct, come, unsavory guide, thou desperate pilot, now at once run on the dashing rock thy seasick, weary bark. Here's to my love. O true apothecary, thy drugs are quick, thus with a kiss I die. All right, there's a lot to unpack here, so let's get into it, shall we? He starts off by saying that he's having a moment of happiness. He feels merry despite the fact that he's about to kill himself. Now, this could be for a number of reasons. Because he's finally with Juliet again, even if he thinks she's dead. Because he thinks his suicide is about to reunite them, or simply because he's relieved to have reached the end of his life, which he has already decided on, if you remember. But there's also something else that's interesting about the way he phrases it, because he doesn't necessarily say that he feels happy. He says it's something that often occurs in men that are about to die, specifically in prisoners. That part becomes clear when he says, which their keepers call a lightning before death. Keepers are prison guards. So Romeo is saying that prisoners, in the moments before they're about to be executed, experience a moment of levity or happiness, and he puts himself in the role of such a prisoner. Now, as we will later on see, this fits his general perception that life and fate have kept him prisoner, and he's now breaking free. But he also says, "Oh, how may I call this lightning?" One possible reason why he might struggle to call this moment lightning is that lightning is only a brief and sudden flash, whereas Romeo expects the happiness that awaits him, a reunion with Juliet by means of killing himself, to be eternal. Then his eyes land on Juliet, and he says, "O my love, my wife, death that hath sucked the honey of thy breath hath had no power yet upon thy beauty. Thou art not conquered, beauty's ensign yet is crimson in thy lips and in thy cheeks, and death's pale flag is not advanced there." First of all, he calls Juliet his wife, and that matters because everyone in Verona believes that she was Paris's intended bride. But Romeo immediately reasserts, to himself and to the audience, that she is not. Even in supposed death, he honors her choice and agency by letting her be the wife she chose to become and not the wife that everyone expected her to be. Also, there's some real dramatic irony here. Romeo immediately notices that death has taken Juliet's breath, but not her beauty. Now, the audience knows, of course, that this is because Juliet isn't actually dead yet. And even Romeo notices the signs of life in her rosy cheeks and lips. But because he doesn't know that Juliet is still alive, he interprets these signs through the tragically wrong assumption that Juliet must indeed be dead, and that death simply hasn't had time to steal her beauty yet. He doesn't phrase it like that, though. He says that Juliet is not conquered yet and imagines beauty and death as two opposing armies fighting over Juliet's body. The crimson color in her lips and cheeks becomes beauty's ensign or banner, while death's pale flag has not advanced on her yet. So Romeo sees Juliet's beauty as something that is still resisting death, even though the audience knows that the color in her face is evidence that she is still alive. But before Romeo can dwell on that any further, he notices Tybalt's body lying nearby and says this: "Tybalt, liest thou there in thy bloody sheet? Or what more favour can I do to thee than with that hand that cut thy youth in twain, to sunder his that was thine enemy? Forgive me, cousin." Now this is interesting. He frames his suicide as a favor to Tybalt, as though killing himself would make up for the fact that he killed him. In that sense, Romeo views his suicide as an act of self administered justice. However, and I hope I have made this abundantly clear at this point, the audience, especially an Elizabethan one, would not have agreed with him. Suicide cannot right anything because it is in itself a very sinful act. We do see, however, that Romeo is still remorseful about killing Tybalt because he asks him for forgiveness at the end there and explicitly calls Tybalt his cousin, which underlines the familial connection that exists between them through his marriage to Juliet. And speaking of Juliet, Romeo turns his attention back to her when he says, "Ah, dear Juliet, why art thou yet so fair?" So he still can't reconcile her apparent death with the fact that she looks so alive and beautiful, which is why he comes up with another explanation. He says, "Shall I believe that unsubstantial death is amorous, and that the lean abhorred monster keeps thee here in dark to be his paramour? In other words, am I supposed to think that death is so in love with you that he keeps you beautiful so that he can be your lover in the afterlife?" And then he makes it very clear that yes, he does think that. Because he says, "For fear of that, I will stay with thee, and never from this palace of dim night depart again. Here will I remain, with worms that are thy chambermaids. Or here will I set up my everlasting rest, and shake the yoke of inauspicious stars from this world-wearied flesh." For fear of that ties directly back to the previous lines, where Romeo wondered if Death is in love with Juliet and says that part of the reason he's going to kill himself is in order to reclaim Juliet from Death. If Death has claimed her for himself, then Romeo will enter Death's domain through killing himself so that he can be with Juliet also. And that way, his suicide becomes partly an act of jealousy, partly an act of probably misguided romantic devotion. But there's also another bit of interesting imagery in his lines here. He calls the tomb a palace of dim night and says that the worms are Juliet's chambermaids. So he turns the tomb into a grotesque and corrupted version of a bridal chamber because, from his point of view, their final marital union can only occur in death. I say from his point of view because remember, Juliet is not dead yet. If Romeo wasn't so determined to kill himself and only waited a few more minutes, maybe had a good cry about losing the love of his life, Juliet would wake up and Romeo would see that she was never dead to begin with. So remember, kids, always have a good cry before making important life decisions. Anyway, back to the analysis. Romeo also says that by dying, he will shake the yoke of inauspicious stars from this world-wearied flesh. First of all, he calls himself world-weary, which ties back to the fact that he already considers his life effectively over and is ready to die. But he also frames his death as shaking of the yoke of fate or of inauspicious stars. Now, a yoke is most commonly a wooden device placed across the necks of animals, such as oxen, so that they can be controlled and made to pull a plow across a field. Because of that, it's also used as a symbol of oppression, burden, and subjugation. So Romeo imagines fate as something that has been weighing down on and controlling him, and he believes that death will finally allow him to throw it off. However, we as the audience know that his death will only fulfill the proclamation of the prologue that a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. So by trying to escape his fate, Romeo actually fulfills it. And then his speech becomes almost ritualistic. He says, "Eyes look your last, arms take your last embrace, and lips, O you, the doors of breath, seal with a righteous kiss a dateless bargain to engrossing death." He breaks his body down into its individual parts, each of which has a final function to fulfill. His eyes take one last look at Juliet. His arms embrace her one last time. His lips give her their final kiss. This slows the moment down and gives it its final dramatic weight. There's even more to Romeo's last kiss. He says it's righteous, which once again lets him present his decision to kill himself as the morally correct choice, allowing him to remain Juliet's faithful lover and husband in perpetuity. But he also uses the kiss to seal a bargain with death. This is another moment of grotesqueness. Usually, a kiss is used to seal a romantic union, i.e., a marriage. Romeo uses it to seal a contract with death. In short, he's signing his life away with a kiss. And now we have reached Romeo's final lines. Come, bitter conduct, come, unsavory guide, thou desperate pilot, now at once run on the dashing rocks thy seasick weary bark. Here's to my love. And he drinks the poison. O true apothecary, thy drugs are quick, thus with a kiss I die. Romeo addresses the poison directly here, calling it a bitter conduct and an unsavory guide. On the literal level, both words describe the poison's actual taste. It's bitter and unpleasant. On the metaphorical level, though, they also capture the nature of the journey that the poison is about to take him on. It's not a comforting or desirable guide. It is literally leading him towards self-destruction. He develops that image even further when he calls the poison a desperate pilot steering his seasick weary bark into dashing rocks. A bark is a ship, so Romeo imagines his exhausted body as a vessel that has been battered and sickened by its journey through life. This also ties into his earlier description of his body as world-wearied. The poison then becomes the pilot that will finally wreck that vessel against the rocks and destroy it. But Romeo is still the one who calls upon that pilot and drinks the poison. So even though he imagines the poison as something that's guiding him towards death, the shipwreck, his death, is still a deliberate choice that Romeo makes. He chooses the means by which he will end his life. And the poison works instantly. Romeo praises the apothecary as true because his drugs do exactly what he promised they would. There's almost a cruel irony in that, don't you think? Almost every other plan, message, or carefully arranged scheme in this play has gone wrong in some way, shape, or form. The one thing that works perfectly is the poison. It kills Romeo within moments, just before Friar Lawrence arrives in the churchyard and Juliet wakes up. His final words are, "Thus with a kiss I die." The most obvious interpretation is that Romeo kisses Juliet one last time as he dies, once again combining romantic intimacy with the grotesqueness of death. But the kiss may also be connected to the bottle of poison he's just brought to his lips. Romeo's final kiss is connected to both Juliet and the substance that kills him. And with that, my fellow readers and story lovers, we have reached the end of this week's analysis. Let's move into this video's conclusion, shall we? Neither Romeo nor Paris act as villains in this scene, but neither of them has all the necessary information to understand the situation completely. Paris thinks that Romeo is a dangerous criminal who has returned to Verona to do some villainous shame to the dead bodies, and wants to apprehend him. He doesn't know that Romeo and Juliet are married, and Romeo has come to the Capulet tomb to grieve his wife. Romeo doesn't even know that it's Paris who tries to apprehend him until he's already killed him. He just wants to be left alone so that he can kill himself because he thinks that's the only way he can be with his beloved Juliet again. Both of them are tragically wrong. Romeo does kill Paris, which makes Paris another tragically young victim of the Capulet Montague feud. Paris may not be directly involved in the feud itself, but he still becomes collateral damage of it. Despite his madness, remember Romeo calls himself a madman in line 67, Romeo honors Paris's last wish and carries him into the Capulet tomb so that he can be buried with Juliet. Romeo then gets to say a rather long and theatric goodbye, in which he laments Juliet's beauty even in death, positions death as his romantic rival, frames his suicide as a way to reclaim Juliet from this rival lover, and describes the tomb as a corrupted version of a bridal chamber where he will lay himself to everlasting rest with his beloved Juliet. The tragic irony of the whole thing is, of course, that Juliet is not dead yet, and if Romeo only waited a few more minutes before killing himself, she would wake up, and his suicide, and the final catastrophe that follows it, could be averted. But of course, Romeo is far too determined to go through with his suicide. In his last few lines, his speech becomes almost ritualistic, and he seals his death with a kiss, another fusing of the romantic with the grotesque. He then treats the poison as a pilot steering his body, which he metaphorically describes as a ship or a bark, onto dashing rocks. This almost makes it sound as though the poison is the thing that's destroying him, but Romeo is still the one who decides to drink it, which, above all else, makes his suicide a deliberate choice. He dies immediately from the effects of the poison, moments before Friar Lawrence enters the churchyard, which might be one of the cruelest moments of irony that Shakespeare has put into this play. But we're going to talk more about that in the next video. For now, this is me signing off. By William Shakespeare, who has returned to questions in lines 87. That's the way you say that. Depiction. I mean, it is a depiction when you go watch the play on stage. Challenging. What was that? It was going so well. Thanks everyone for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like, share, and comment down below. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you don't want to miss any of my future videos. I also have a Patreon that you can subscribe to, starting at as little as $2 a month, which gives you early access to any of my videos. Higher tiers include access to exclusive Patreon-only content and the chance to suggest books, plays, or poems for any future analysis. For now, that is it from me, and I'll see you next time.